We're talking about the Christian Middle Ages from AD 590 to 517. We've made our way to 1095, which is the First Crusade, launched by the Council of Clermont in response to a request for military assistance from the Emperor of Byzantium. And there's a speech by Pope Urban II that convinces leaders to take action, so that waves of pilgrims and soldiers embark for the Holy Land, beginning an era of exploration, conquest, defeat, and folly. Over the next couple of centuries, from 1095 to 1291, there would be anywhere from 7 to 9 major crusades launched, and a number of other crusades, where the idea was, hey, God's people need to take this land. The Muslims had come in and taken over Jerusalem and Judea, the land of Palestine, and they were in charge, and so they said, hey, we as Christians ought to have this land. So there was this big cry for this, which led to these conquests. And so it was fighting back and forth. They say, well, even Muslims, they say, well, the Christians started the Crusades. Well, we started the Crusades, but it was also in response to what the Muslims had already done in running out the Christians and the Jews and overthrowing them. In 1115, Bernard founds the monastery at Clairvaux and becomes a leading thinker in that era, influential through the Catholic Church. By 1150, the universities of Paris and Oxford are founded. Centuries later, the study of humanities ultimately leads to the Renaissance and Reformation, as these schools, these universities are places of leading thought to think through what is it that God has revealed, and it led to eventually a Renaissance. In 1173, you have the Waldensian movement that began, where they promote poverty and preach the gospel, rejecting the authority of the priest. It's one of these early attempts during the Dark Ages, Christian ages, to argue against the Roman Catholic Church and the structures they had set up in place, to say, no, this is not what we're about. We should be about preaching the gospel. We shouldn't be about wealth. We should be about poverty. We should be following Christ's example, and so forth. By 1208, Francis of Assisi renounces wealth. So he too is seeing how much wealth the Roman Catholics are promoting. He renounces it to focus on a simple gospel. Later, he founded the Franciscan order. By 1215, we have, this is related, Magna Carta, the first Western document to renounce the complete rights of kings and begin to argue for a republic or democratic form of government that became much popular later on, especially in the West. In 1220, the Dominican order established with preachers focused on teaching and conversion. So you see in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, all these rise of groups of individuals or people who are arguing for a simple gospel, that there had been too much that the Roman Church had added on to what the Christian faith should look like. And so they're trying to return to that. They're trying to get rid of the wealth, and they're trying to focus on the gospel message at its essence. By 1232, Gregory IX appoints the first inquisidors to root out heresy from Roman Catholic Europe, to go and question, and if it means they had to torture them or kill them, they would do so. And so we see that being played out, and it would play out over the next several centuries in different places. By 1272, so you had Anselm before, now you have Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. It's a massive treatise set forth a theological system so influential, it's been declared eternally valid. But much like God had used Anselm, now Aquinas is being used to deal with theology and philosophy there in the medieval ages. By 1302, you have the Unum Sanctum, proclaims the papal supremacy by Pope Boniface VIII. By 1309, you have the papacy beginning the 72-year Babylonian exile in Avignon. So they no longer reside in Rome. And there's this whole debate going on between, who's supposed to be the correct pope? Is he supposed to live in Rome or wherever? But he goes to Avignon, France. They stay there for 72 years. They call that the Babylonian exile. By 1328, you got Dante completing his Divine Comedy with the expression of heaven and hell and purgatory. By 1378, you have the Great Papal Schism beginning, when two rival popes are being elected, and then at one point, to do away with both, who neither one are willing to give up, they elect a third pope. And every time they elect a new pope, none of the others are willing to give up being a pope. So it's not just they have one pope, they have two popes. Now they've moved to three popes, all vying for supremacy. And so there's this 40-year crisis that takes place in the church from 1378 until 1417, and a council declared who the real pope was. Well, that's convenient because now the council is saying they have authority over the pope. And so the new pope says, the council has all authority on previous matters except ruling over me. So they were trying to say, the pope's trying to say he's above the council was trying to show they were above the pope, and so you start to have this struggle play out here in the late 14th century. By 1318, you have John Wycliffe, who supervised the English Bible translation from the Latin Vulgate. Now, he doesn't use the original Greek and Hebrew that's going to become popular in the Reformation era, but he does take the Latin Vulgate and translate it. And the first time it's been translated into English, and God uses Wycliffe tremendously during that time to see many people come to faith because now they can read the Bible in their own language. They don't have to depend on Latin that no one speaks anymore, and they just have to be dependent on what the priest tell them it means. By 1414, you have the Council of Constance begins to determine the real pope, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, and they took about a 3-year process to figure all that out. By 1413, you have John Huss, a disciple of Wycliffe, who's burned at the stake for his views of sharing what we might call a pre-reformer. He's someone, or a forerunner to the Reformation, who's teaching some of the basics about the gospel that Martin Luther would take a stand for later on. 1418, Thomas à Kempis writes The Imitation of Christ, one of the greatest devotional works ever written, especially now that it's over 600 years old and continues to be read. 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for her role in leading throughout France and sort of rebellion against some of the false groups that were in charge. By 1453, you have Constantinople falls, which was huge because the Muslims were finally able to overthrow it. It's the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. But as that's falling, the libraries of Constantinople were carried into the heart of Europe as they fled to the west. And they went to places like Florence in Italy and elsewhere. And it's those documents that would be studied in the coming decades where there would be a rebirth or renaissance of literature, arts, music, but also even the Greek and Hebrew text. By 1456, Gutenberg produces the first printed Bible. So now that you have the first printed press, the Bible is the first document, the first book to be produced from that. And now what used to take weeks and months to translate now can just happen. You can just print up copies overnight, and the Christian faith can spread much more quickly. So Scripture can now be placed directly in the hands of the people, which is more affordable now because they can print it a lot cheaper than paying someone to just copy it by hand. And more folks are able to read the Bible for themselves. By 1479, you have the establishment of Spanish Inquisition by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella against the Jews and against the Moors. The Moors were a Muslim group that had come across that Strait of Gibraltar and just kind of hung out there in Spain all those years. And so the Inquisition is to drive those out. They don't want anything more to do with them. And of course, you remember King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, 1479, just a few years later, while they're still on the throne, would permit Christopher Columbus to go to the New World to take Spanish and Roman Catholic influence over there. 1506, work begins on St. Peter's Basilica in Rome that would take a couple of decades. More will be on that in a future video. In 1512, Michelangelo completes the Sistine Chapel frescoes there in Rome. And by 1516, Erasmus publishes his Greek New Testament. And that's important because he's now studying the Greek as those libraries have come from the East and come back to where they can be in protected hands. And so he writes something that now people who are learning Greek as they're studying these documents and these languages afresh can see, and they can see what the New Testament was written in originally and see what it actually teaches, where the Latin Vulgate's wrong and where the priests have been teaching it wrongly. That's going to be important in the years ahead.